So we're hearing a lot about information, and it's really surprising. We were at a conference last fall when the subject of how information gets transmitted was discussed. How few people really realize the ins and outs of communication. And many agencies are operating on the assumption that everybody has broadband. And when the word got out, even from the commercial shipping outfits, that in fact not many had broadband, some relying on low Earth orbit satellite kind of stuff, you know, the Iridium and the rest, there was a, oh. So it's very important when you look at all of the stuff we're talking about today and you're thinking about taking it offshore that you carefully consider communications. And this afternoon, we have one of the premier communicators. Jim Corenman is better known as SailMail or Airmail or Mail. That's a very, very well-used system and has a great deal of experience as an engineer inventor in communications. Jim.
Thank you, Frank. Well, thank you. Yeah, honored to be here. This is a terrific group and a great event. Thank you, Frank, for organizing it. We've heard a lot of content. Joe's pretty pictures, a lot of charts, a lot of graphics. We're now going to talk about the challenge of how we get that onto the boat. If you're sitting in the marina with broadband Wi-Fi connection, it's easy. So planning your departure, planning your voyage is not the problem. It's what happens once you get going. And that's a gulf which gets bigger. I mean, 25 megabits is now the standard for broadband, but the bottom end of that scale, what you can do over a satellite or radio connection, has not changed very much. The things we've talked about, quick recap. Got a pointer here somewhere?
There's a controller there and a pointer here.
Lovely. Perfect. The text bulletins, the text warnings. Text is terrific because it's not very big, just a few bytes. That is, I think, top of the list of what you need. Graphics, we'll be talking about. The charts that were tossed up by the hundreds, we'll talk about. The GRIB files, the data files, we're also going to talk about. How to get it. You've got choices. We mentioned the marina, but once you're gone, email is the vehicle for getting that stuff back and forth. It can go by radio. You can do charts by radio. WeatherFax, still around, still works. You can get voice over VHF or single sideband, and you've got a bunch of satellite options. Bottom line is, what do you do with it? And I think Ralph's going to play, clean up here. When you get it to your nav station, you need to understand how to use that data. And what I keep talking about is reading between the isobars. The forecaster's job generally has been in the past to describe the single most likely scenario, the deterministic that they talked about earlier. What you really want to know is, what's the probability of something really ugly happening if I make these choices? Okay. So it changed here, didn't change there. What am I doing wrong? Help me out, Ralph. It's changing on the screen here, but not the screen up there.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I think Ken broke it.
It is.
Yeah, it's PowerPoint, yeah.
It is working. It's not.
But it's not cycling the screen. Okay, we need some tech help here. Everybody's got a sea story. Mine is going to go back a little ways when we were in New Zealand. Susie and I have a 50-foot sloop, Schumacher design. circumnavigated, left in, well, we left home around 1990, did a bunch of 2 or 3 Hawaii races in a row, down to Mexico, took off from Mexico, went to South Pacific, spent 2 summers down in New Zealand. Kiwis were a lot of fun. When we were headed back up toward Tonga after first summer in New Zealand was end of May. We went with a rally, local cruising group out of New Zealand, mostly cruising sailors and variety of experience. Nobody in New Zealand who sails has, they've all got good experience. I mean, they're mad keen. And this was the trip. Right around the end of May, from Auckland up to Tonga. And these images were ones that I copied by fax on the boat, and Dashu reprinted in his weather book. If you've got a copy, go look it up. He talks about this quite a bit. Easy trip. This low pressure down there had been hanging around New Zealand, strong winds, and everybody had been holed up for about 2 weeks. Weather broke, that storm moved eastwards, and all the forecasts looked good. This is what it looked like the day we left, or the day after we left. This is the first sign of trouble that I saw. And again, we were getting all this on 1 chart a day off WeatherFax. This little wiggle in this isobar in the tropics is not supposed to be there. And these are 5 millibar spacings. For tropical charts, if you're doing your own display on grid files and so forth, I like to use 2 millibars because stuff will show that is only a very shallow low. This was only a 1 or 2 millibar low that's been hanging around there. We learned later, have been hanging around for weeks. One of those things that the ham radio guys talked about and nobody ascribed any significance to. A bunch of guys talking. Wiggle in the isobar turned into that. Close low, 1001 millibar, very, very shallow, shouldn't be there. This is the tropics. Don't like low pressure in the tropics. They showed it headed south 15 knots. There were no warnings at this time. A day later, it was down to, it had dropped about 20 millibars, I think. Note that the high pressure over New Zealand has not moved and will not move. So we're developing a vice here. At this point, we were up in here. When we saw the wiggle in the isobar, we basically just kept the hammer down. A lot of folks, when the warning first came out, which was the picture before this, the advice from some of the Kiwi net operators was wait or go west or stop, let it pass. But it was going south and it was going eastwards. And we went north as fast as we could. So we covered about, I think, 1,100 miles in a little over 5 days. So we were up in here. Yeah, good boats are nice. This is what it turned into next. The high pressure has not moved, right? We learned later as we discovered the 500 millibar thingy and all that, that was a big stacked high and wasn't gonna move. And this area right here, I think the number was 7 boats lost, 3 lives lost off of 1 boat, never found. 18 boats needed assistance or rescue of some sort. And yeah, end of story. The seamanship thing to take away is there was no particular predictability of what type of boat floundered. Westsail 32 was lost. Last boat I would expect to have trouble in heavy weather. There were 2 Ferro Cement 50-footers home built. Very nervous about them. They were fine. They just went down below, had a cup of tea, and waited it out. A Kiwi Belt, very strong race boat, was the one that was lost with all hands. Catamaran Ramtha was lost their steering right in the middle of the whole thing. They were certain they were going to lose the boat. They were pulled off through the water from a line that was fired across from the rescue ship, Monowai, drugged through about 100 yards of ocean, mostly underwater. The boat was later found completely intact, towed into Tonga. Just no way to know. So it's not a boat issue, it's a weather issue. We'll talk more about this situation in terms of the data we had. This is all we had with these fax charts. And we were trying to read between the isobars and trying to figure out what was going to happen. We weren't at that time familiar with the 3D level of the atmosphere, what to do with the 500 millibars. Didn't matter because New Zealand didn't transmit it. They didn't send a 24-hour forecast. They didn't send any forecast by fax. All you got was one daily chart. Turned out the Fiji Met guys, north of 25 South, were all over this thing. They didn't have any way to send faxes. New Zealand had no way to get the data from Fiji without somebody paying $1 a day for a telephone fax, which they didn't do because nobody had it in the budget. There you go. All right, back to current. The tech stuff I would put top of the list. Joe talked about the guy at the desk writing the forecasts. That is the best way to get what he wrote, is just a text bulletin. You can get it off a single sideband. You can just dial in the Coast Guard frequencies 2 or 3 times a day, copy it. If you've got email, it's simple, they're very small. If you're ashore, of course, or in a marina, just get it off the web. I didn't put here, but also the forecaster discussions are also available by text. And this is the notes that the guy writes on his little pad at the side while he's trying to figure all this stuff out, and it can be very interesting. Fax charts. Those are the charts that we've seen a lot of. They tend to be black and white, as Lee mentioned. They do 24, 48, 96 hours. I understand somebody mentioned 72 to come. That's terrific. Those are the big pictures. They won't tell you what the wind speed's going to be along your track with any accuracy, but they tell you what's happening in the ocean, okay? And they like to write little things on them like developing or intensifying or things like that, which you won't see elsewhere. Numerical data. Joe touched on this. They're beginning to produce forecasts in gridded numerical form. Now, you can also get access to the model output, GFS and some of the others, in numerical form as data files. 2 things are interesting there. One is you can get a longer outlook. I mean, the models go out, GFS goes out 16 days. Nobody's going to tell you that it's meaningful past about halfway at the most. But if you're going to speculate for a long passage, you can either guess yourself or you can take the model guess as some guidance. The other thing we like about numerical data is that it's compact. You can do pretty little pictures on your own computer, but the data behind that to generate that pretty picture is just the numerical data, not the pretty graphics. Okay, here's a typical text bulletin. Starts with a synopsis, goes on, and actually the whole thing runs well down underneath the floor of the building below. Broken up in terms of synopsis and then forecasts for specific areas. Very important. Here's the end of it. Remainder of area, winds 20 knots or less, seas less than 8 feet. It will not help you find the fastest route to your destination. Their job is to give you the warnings and the strong winds, okay? So keep that in mind. Here's a discussion document pulled down today for the high seas. And these are the forecaster's comments. And if you scroll down to the bottom, it'll have a signature on it. And with practice, you'll find out who you like and who you don't like. But they're all good. Okay, we talked about this quickly. If you're sailing on the coast, turn on the VHF radio. The coastal forecast will be there. You can get the high seas, offshore and high seas, via voice from Coast Guard. Boring, you say you got to sit there and listen to the radio, but if everything else is broken, it works. So you want to be able to pick up a single sideband broadcast. If you've got email, that's dead nuts easy. Navtex on the coast, if you're within range of one of the stations, and especially in Europe because of language differences, Navtex is very helpful. And if you can get to a web page from shore, by all means do it. This is a fax chart. You've seen a bunch of those. Black and white because that's dead simple. When sent by radio, broadcast weather fax, they are sending one copy for everyone to receive, okay? Takes about 10 minutes to send that image. If you're doing it by email, SailDocs, which is the SailMail's weather server, reduces the size by half. One of the things you notice is they print big because there is loss of resolution when you send by weather fax. It gets fuzzy, it gets distorted, so they intentionally make the images oversized. You can reduce it by half, send it by email, and you're in great shape. This is same point in time, I'm not sure. I think it's a few hours off. This is a reconstruction of the numerical data from the GFS model. So this is what the forecaster used as input to his desk. Will be largely unchanged, but it's missing the frontal lines, it's missing the warnings and so forth. It's just the numerical data, but it's got very detailed wind data, as detailed as you want to pay for data for. They'll go down to a 1/4 degree, 25-kilometer grid. If you do that over a large area like the whole ocean like this, it's a very large file. This is on I think on a 5-degree grid, and it's a pretty modest file size. Okay, charts. Really recommend radio weather fax, okay? Obsolete technology. They were doing that back in the 70s with light bulbs and photocells and so forth. Still works, still viable, and does not take a huge pile of equipment. You can get it on a computer off your single sideband. You can also use your fax machine if you still got one, take lots of paper. I don't think any of them probably still work anymore. Or as email attachments. This is an over-the-air copied a few years ago from where we are in Washington State, from Point Reyes, 1,500 miles south of us, over the single sideband. You can see this little bar of black snow across there. That's just a static burst, perfectly readable. That's the same thing off the internet. We talked about GRIB files again. Coded numeric data. This chart was created in our computer on board, and a much, much smaller file. Remember that GRIB is a data format. It can be a numerical model. GFS is NOAA's primary model. The GEFS we'll probably begin to hear more about as the ensemble forecast that Joe mentioned. Basically perturb the inputs, and they run 21 parallel models as outputs. You're not going to want to download 21 different GRIB files and sort them through yourself. What Joe put up there was the probability chart. I think there's room there for some clever work to somehow convey graphically how much variability there was amongst those 21 models for the piece of ocean you care about. WW3 is the wave model, RTOFS is ocean currents, HRRR is the high res. Only goes out 18 hours. We've been using it for coastal, for local racing and stuff like that. It's terrific, but it doesn't go very far. And it doesn't go very far afield. It's basically a North America model. Covers part of Mexico down to Baja. It probably covers down to Cuba on the other side. NDFD is the forecaster-generated numerical data. Starts with GFS, gets massaged by the forecaster at the desk, gets spit out the back end. You saw Joe's image. Right now it's limited in area. I am really, really excited to hear that they're going to be expanding it across the Atlantic and into the Pacific. And as one comment was made, any kind of weather forecasting, you've got to be looking west. You've got to be looking farther upstream from where you are. Okay, so these GRIB files, where to get them? There's a number of services that make them available. We do through SailDocs. That's a public server, saildocs.com. Go have a look. It'll tell you how to format a request, send a file back. If you're using SailMail or using WinLink on the ham radio side, then the software has a request window to get it. There's other services. Global MarineNet provides satellite service. They've got their own GRIB file server. UU Plus is another satellite provider. I don't know if they have their own data. We see a lot of them on SailDocs. You've got a choice there. You can make the file as big or as small as you want. It's simple function of how much area you want to cover and how much detail you would like. And they can be as little as 10K, 20K bytes. It's a few minutes on an Iridium phone, and they can be megabytes if you want to do planning. Does require a specialized viewing program to reconstruct the chart at your end. Most of the charting programs will do that. Coastal Navigator, OpenCPN, most of them have a GRIB file import function that will reconstruct the chart. My preference is to put it against a fairly simple background, because if you start throwing weather birdies and so forth on top of a nautical chart, then you really compromise your ability to look at either as a clean display. Limitations. Except for the NDFD, it's direct model output. So you are looking at what the forecaster is looking at, not what he has concluded. So you are taking the responsibility to verify the data, make sure it makes sense. Simple thing to do is go look at your barometer, look at your WeatherFax chart or your GRIB file for where you are. Does it make sense? Is it right? And availability for the model data certainly exceeds accuracy. So, a forecast is a most likely scenario. I think Ken made the point very well that it may not be right. You really want to know the range of possibilities. Two ways to do that. Pay attention to the 500 millibar, okay? If you've got what looks like a benign surface pattern and the 500 millibar is showing a trough coming through, then that's an area that is going to be uncertain, okay? Because an upper level trough will tend to generate or intensify a surface low. And that's in fact what happened, we learned a couple of years later, is what happened to us on the way to Tonga. There was a low pressure system sitting up there. What nobody was paying any attention to was a upper level trough came off the coast of Australia, and as it cleared the coast of Australia, reached way up into the tropics. They rarely do that. But it was a very, very deep trough that passed over the top of this innocent-looking little low up by Vanuatu, intensified it, and then that trough, those upper-level winds carried it down south and east. And at the time, I don't think anybody had caught it. So learn to read the 500 millibar chart. So we'll get into what the choices are for equipment, but all of them are limited in terms of data capacity. You might have 10 or 20 megabits at home, but you're going to be talking kilobits per second offshore. Text bulletins are great because the information is important. They are inherently pretty small, and they're highly compressible. Anytime you see repeating patterns in any kind of a document, you know that the software can compress it. Same word appears 5 times. Trouble, 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 times 5. Easy to do. Image files are inherently large. They're photographs, okay? The smallest, like a 500 millibar chart that SailDocs has whacked down to half size, is going to be around 15 to 20 kilobytes, okay? And that's for one chart, one point in time, right? One forecast. A GRIB file that covered 10 different forecast times and a bunch of different parameters would be about the same size over a limited area. So The thing about an image file is it depends on the size of the image and how the resolution and how many colors. A lot of what is really easy to make things stand out, as we've seen today, are all the pretty colors. Yellow isobars, blue lines for this, makes the weather pattern very obvious. You can do that with numerical data. If you start to send it as a color image, the size instantly goes up by at least a factor of 4. And that's if you just want to do a few colors. If you want to do full color, some of the color scales, they get huge quickly. That's just a fact of life, and we don't know how to fix it. So be conservative. Grid files can be whatever you want. Simple formula. Bigger area, more resolution means more data points. More forecast times means more data points. More different parameters in your file means more data points. The systems allow you to choose, okay? But practice before you start running it through your Iridium phone for $1.50 a minute. Fire it up at home, play with it, look at the picture sizes, and decide what makes sense for you. If you want to cover the whole ocean and get a sense of what the Atlantic is doing or the Pacific, go get the broadcast weather facts chart. But if you want to do it with a grid file, then you want a pretty low-res, multiple degrees between data point file, okay, to keep the size down. And if you're looking at the whole Atlantic, you don't need to know every 25 kilometers what the wind is going to be. 2 days in front of your boat, you do want to know that. Okay, choices. At home, easy. In a marina with Wi-Fi, easy. If you're coastal sailing, cell phone data, okay? If you're going to Mexico, talk to the local providers, get a SIM card for your phone or your little hotspot. Stan's been up and down Mexico, Honduras, down to Costa Rica recently, and he's been using mostly his cell phone. Works fine. The cell phone companies have done a very, very good job of making voice and data available pretty much anywhere. You're probably going to want a local SIM card and a local plan from a local provider because it will be a lot cheaper than getting the international option on your Verizon. T-Mobile's got good stuff, but they limit the speed on foreign connections. Offshore, a lot of discussion of whether you want to have an HF radio, right? Couple of thoughts. There's a lot of stuff that is on HF radio that is hard to find elsewhere. But most particularly, none of your friends are going to drop the $1 a minute to call you on your phone, right? You'll be getting together on the beach somewhere, chatting on the VHF if you're 20 miles away. But if you're making a passage in company with a couple other friends, single sideband radio is very, very handy for that, just because of its party line nature. And if you're in trouble, if you need help, the party line nature where everybody can jump on 4125 and chat with each other over a span of a few hundred miles or 1,000 miles is very valuable. So don't cross it off your list. If you got it, you can get broadcast weather facts. You can also do email via radio. The nice thing about doing email over HF radio is there are no airtime charges. The equipment's expensive, but once you've got it, you're done. Satellite, 3 choices, I think. Inmarsat, Iridium, both of those have been in business a long time. Globalstar, ditto. Globalstar, I think, still suffers from limited coverage. They don't have a lot of satellites. They don't have more than 1 or 2 Earth stations. If you're within range, it's good, fast, cheap. Iridium is the #1, and Inmarsat, for larger boats with bigger budgets, makes sense. VHF, done. Nothing for data on VHF, marine VHF, which is odd because the hams have solved it a long time ago. Marine single sideband, that's an M802. Iridium is a low Earth orbit system. They've got 66 active satellites and a bunch of spares. They are in the process of launching the next generation satellites. They've been through bankruptcy. They bought it from the original founders for pennies on the dollar. They've got a government contract, and they've made a successful business out of it. The thing to remember is the satellites are not very far away, a few hundred kilometers. The signals are pretty strong. You don't need a big fancy antenna. You don't have to track them. But they move. There's 11 satellites in each orbit. They go around every 100 minutes or so. So as you sit here, there's an Iridium bird going past. If you're making a phone call, they will hand it off from satellite to satellite, and you keep your call. If you're doing a data connection, when your satellite gets over the horizon and the next one's behind you, it will drop that connection, and you'll have to reconnect to whoever's next. So you get about a 15, 20-minute shot per satellite, and it's going to drop, and you reconnect, and it's a pain. Nature of the beast. We'll talk about the Go in a minute. And if you've got budget, Iridium also makes what they call a pilot. They call it broadband with quotes, but it's only 100K baud or something, which tracks multiple satellites and works quite well at higher speeds. This little guy is the Iridium Go. Everybody familiar with that? It's basically a fat little hotspot that talks to the Iridium satellite and lets you connect to it with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi connection is fast. Its connection to the satellite is the same old 2400 baud. But operationally, it's really simple. About as hard as plugging in a VHF radio. It will do a phone call if you take your smartphone, install their app, dial the number. It acts like the repeater for the telephone system, and it makes phone calls just fine. Yeah, and 9600 baud on the data. Cost is $750 at Walmart, believe it or not. $750 to $800 from your local marine supplier. You do need the external antenna if you're going to be using it below decks. It's got its own little pop-up antenna, but it's a satellite signal. It does not want to go through your deck, even if it's a wooden boat. Interesting thing about the Go is the data cost. Number one, they only charge half as much for the data as they do for voice minutes. I do not know why. And just to be clear, we don't sell any of this stuff. I am involved with SailMail, and we provide service for all these systems, but we're not making a dime off of them. It's about $1.40 a minute. In terms of dollars per megabyte, it's about $14 per megabyte. So if you think you want to do a big fancy grib file that's a couple of megabytes, you're talking serious money. So stick to the small files. The really interesting thing about the Go, and brave on their part, I think, is they have an unlimited data plan. Now, they're only protected by the low speed, but for $125 a month, times 3 months minimum, you can get all the data you want to sit around and wait for. So if you're off on a summer trip, it's pretty hard to beat that. You know, total cost $800, another couple of hundred for the external antenna, you're into it for $1,000, another $375 for the data, less than $1,500, you're awash in data. And obviously that brings the cost down to as cheap as anything. The other thing I'll touch on, time permitting, is it does have an integral firewall, which solves one of the big issues with any kind of a satellite connection, which is Windows trying to do an update to Windows 10 over your $1-a-minute connection. Okay, this is the Iridium 9575, what they call the Extreme. I think that's what it is. You can get a docking station for it if you want to. You don't need to. You can hook it up to your computer with a USB cable. It acts like a 9600 baud telephone modem. So software can easily make the connection, dial it up, do whatever you want. They run 1,000 to 1,200 depending on whether you get the 9555, which is not completely waterproof, or the 75 Extreme version. And data cost runs about $30 a megabyte. It is higher because they don't do the half price data thing. And again, if you're using it below decks, you need the external antenna. You can go stand up on deck, run a USB cable down your computer, or sit up there talking on the phone. If the weather's bad, attractive idea. Let's talk about Inmarsat. Iridium is low orbit satellites. Inmarsat is geostationary. They've got 3 or 4 satellites. They are 22,000 kilometers up there, or some number like that. Takes about a half a second for voice syllables to land at the other end. Because the satellites are stationary, you know where in the sky they're going to be. You don't have the problem of them going over the horizon waiting for the next one to come by. They do have a handset. This is the Iridium iSat phone. It's the Pro 2. I think it's around $700 from your local provider. Again, you really need an external antenna for these guys. And even if you're hand holding it, you've got to orient it so that the antenna is pointed at the satellite, which means you've got to figure out where the satellite is, but they'll tell you, and you've got a compass, and you know where. It has to be within about 30 degrees because it's connecting to one specific satellite somewhere in the sky, so you got to aim it. The external antennas don't have that problem. They have enough gain and preamp so that they can pick it up from anywhere. If you've got budget, and this is around $5,000 opening, then you can get either the Iridium Pilot we talked about earlier was kind of in the $6,000 or $8,000 range. The Iridium Fleet 1 up to 100 kilobits is I think it's around $5,000, and the megabyte cost is 8 to 12. So it's not much different than the Go on the regular plan. Difference is it's faster. Okay. We alluded to this. Big problem is controlling who's using your expensive or slow connection. With radio connections, it's not a problem. If you're just going to fire up your Iridium or your Inmarsat phone and start sending and receiving data, first in line is going to be your antivirus program, updating your antivirus definitions, Windows updating itself. You've got a long list of software. You've got to protect yourself. There's multiple ways of doing that. The simplest, I think, is just get a Go and use it because it's got a firewall built in, okay? And the software that works with it, whether it's ours or somebody else's, will configure that firewall so that the only software connection that is going to be using the Go is the system that set it up. Windows won't be able to get to their master server. They won't be able to phone home, etc. Some of the software that runs on the handsets that operate basically using a virtual modem are able to dedicate the route or include a firewall to protect the connection. We can do it on SailMail. Global MarineNet, Oceans, for example, they use an external router down here. Talk about a proprietary external box that acts as a firewall and blocks connections except the one you want. If you want to deal with it in your own computer, you can use Windows Firewall. Very effective, very simple in concept, difficult to set up. I mean, you've got to really dive into the bowels of Windows Firewall advanced settings and identify the particular services that you want to allow and turn off everything else. And then redo it when you get the port and you really want to browse the web. There's a program called Glasswire. It's a firewall program, independent, very nice. Look it up. It will identify and tell you who's using your connection. Do this at home before you start paying by the minute. But it'll identify the programs and the ports that are using your connection and let you turn them off. You just say, click, I don't want that, I don't want that, I don't want that. Bunch of clicks, and they're all gone. You can also block them all and then turn on the one you want. We do it by a different method with SailMail, by control of the Windows routing. With our software, simple, works well, if you go that direction. And maintain control of your email address. Whoever you sign up with for email service over satellites or radio or whatever will give you an address that has never been used before. And the only way it will get spammed or posted to somebody's comedies link is if you allow it to happen. And if you get a brand new email address and then sign up with Amazon and have them send all kinds of stuff, you'll be dead. Won't work. That's it. Questions? Back to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I think we're going to take a little break here, but I hope you've been noticing. One thing I didn't mention this morning in the matter of weather forecasting is you. There have been a number of references to you and your important role in the weather forecast, look out the window, sort of a thing. And you heard a little bit more about it in 2 of the talks just now. So you're going to be saving up some messages and questions, because in another hour or so we're going to have a panel you can beat up on the whole bunch.